Hi, and welcome to Psychology 315, Psychological Statistics. Today we'll be covering the introduction to statistics and research design, specifically in the behavioral sciences and psychology. So, most of you have been introduced to the research methodologies that are often involved in psychological research, but up to this point in your academic career, you probably have not covered statistics in terms of what it means for psychology. You had to take Statistics 2.14 before this class, but I want to emphasize that this course will cover more than just the math, okay? Because statistics is a branch of math, but it is not just math. It deals with the collection of data that goes into the math. So there are specific practices about collecting this data, and we will break each of these down. The analysis of the data itself is usually what students come into this course being familiar with in terms of what they learned in Stat 2.14. There usually is an overemphasis on this part of statistics, on calculating the actual results of the analyses and then leaving it there. Most people think about statistics in terms of just this one piece of it. But of course it goes beyond that. Statistics is also about how to interpret those analyses. And statistics also refers to the presentation of the data itself without doing any procedural analyses or results in terms of that part of the math. Okay, so we will break down all of these. We will be mentioning all of these throughout the semester. It is not just mathematical procedures. Why are we learning statistics? Well, beyond just the fact that you need to know it to be knowledgeable in psychology, it's also a part of your daily life. There is not one decision made in terms of policy, in terms of advertisement, in terms of medical treatment, in terms of anything that has to do with human behavior. Statistics plays a part somehow. The goals, beyond just getting you comfortable with how that process occurs and how statistics actually plays a role in your life, is also that to give you a foundation for you to learn how to read and interpret statistical analyses. Now, we are not going to go into the very complicated statistical analyses that you learn in doctorate or master's level type courses, because this is to start you off. This is to get you comfortable with, oh, I know reading this result section of this academic journal, I know how they got here. I know what their goals were and what they found. It's also for you to be aware of how statistics can be misleading in real life, and how to critically think about statistical results reported in your daily life and, of course, in your academic and or professional life later. Also, this class and what you will learn over the semester is going to prepare you for conducting your own research. A lot of students get very inspired by this class, which I'm very thankful for, to conduct their own research. They want to jump on the statistics train and just start collecting data and designing their own research studies. And that is why we're learning this, but also is a goal, is to prepare you to conduct your own research if you want to do so later. And also, finally, just as a side note, statistics is one of the fastest growing employment areas today. It is in very high demand for employees to know how to conduct research and, of course, conduct the actual statistical analyses. So this could be a possible jumping off point for you to advance yourself in your future career. I also have a video here. What can learning statistics mean for you, from the reference website from Centennial College that is on the Moodle page that you can use to refer to, but this is the first section in that website, and there's a video there if you want to learn more about how different careers use statistics and what it might possibly mean for you. Okay. So in this chapter, we're going to be focusing on the research process, how to conduct research in a scientifically sound way. Because without following the proper stages of the research process, your statistical analyses on whatever data you collect is useless, it's meaningless. So these first two steps are what we will focus on mostly in this chapter, because the rest of the semester will be focusing on the other three. Okay, but without that first foundation, you're already starting off wrong, incorrectly, because any data collected without properly following steps 1 and 2 is useless to the actual math, to the analysis itself. So within these first two stages, we have 3 tasks that you must complete before you move on and before you actually go about calculating statistics, so statistical analyses. So the first stage, there are 3 tasks associated with it. Of course, the first step is developing a hypothesis. So I like to tell my students before we dive into this that whenever they go to conduct their own research, if they ever plan to, this takes the longest time. This is where majority of researchers' time and effort is very much spent, because it is not just thinking of a study and then conducting it. Without this first step being accomplished correctly, you are now setting yourself up for failure in the research process. So task 1, of course, is going to be, what are you interested in? What is the question or issue that you're trying to examine? You are starting the research process off. You obviously have a good indication of what human behavior or aspect of human behavior that you want to study. So where can the actual question or issue come from and then be turned into a hypothesis? Well, of course, it can be your own observations in life. It could be your own ideas or experiences that you have about humans and human behavior. But there is a important restriction on using just these first 2 sources to identify your question or issue. In the research process, we want to avoid doing what's called throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. A very sad but very relevant example of this is human experimentation during the Holocaust. If you've taken any history class or learned anything about the Holocaust and particularly the concentration camps, there were many doctors, there were many quote-unquote researchers that wanted to see what would happen if they did something to another human, and that's it. That's where they stopped. They just wanted to know what would happen if they did this, this, or this. Of course, this resulted in extremely horrendous and horrific experimentation on Holocaust prisoners, concentration camp prisoners, and it really gave the scientific community of the world a lesson. It provided an important lesson to starting the research process. You cannot just be curious about something and think that you can conduct research to try it out. Okay, that's why number 3 here, where valid question and issues can come from, is the big one. Okay, as a researcher, you have to do the work and read what other people have done. You have to identify theories and you have to find the research. And this takes a very long time, and it is worth it in the end because it provides the foundation for your actual study. And without this foundation, you can't conduct a study, and therefore you can't get data, and then you can't analyze the data. So the statistical process here stops if you have not done your previous research. So for this lecture, we're going to work with 4 research questions that have been the foundation for actual studies done in psychology. I have here what we're going to call my whiteboard. because this is what I would be writing on the board in class if we were in person. Forgive my handwriting, but basically we're going to fill in parts of the research process at each stage on this portion of the lecture. So within your own notes, you can write whatever you want, as long as it is, parallel to what we're covering each time we come to this window. Okay. So for the first one, I called it SL for student learning, because the first research question is college students' performance on tests more influenced by their motivation, basically why they learn, or learning strategies, i.e. how they learn. Okay, so we'll call this one SL, student learning. Number 2, how do parents' feeding practices affect whether their children will eat new foods? I called this one FP for feeding practices. Okay. For number 3, does coercive interrogation of eyewitnesses affect their accusations of crime suspects? I called it I for interrogation. Of course, you can write out whatever titles you want for these in your notes. Just make sure you know which one they're referring to as we progress. And then number 4, I just put a W for Wikipedia because the research question is, are there gender differences in terms of who contributes to Wikipedia? So these are all real-world research questions that, of course, the corresponding authors did their due diligence to find information on in terms of reviewing and evaluating relevant theories, and previously conducted research before they did theirs. So the first step here is finding relevant theories. There are thousands of theories out there in psychology. You must take the time to find and review as many as possible in the relevant literature associated underneath that theory. Who else has been interested in this and used a certain theoretical perspective? How did they do their study? How did they get to the point of actually collecting data and conducting the statistical analyses? They had to start from a theory. Okay, now you should have learned this, of course, basically at the beginning of every psychology course. You learn about what theory is in psychology. Now in terms of scientific research, it's a little bit more specific, but it is the same at its core. It's a set of propositions used to describe or explain a phenomenon that have been empirically researched and or tested. This means that it's not just somebody's idea in their head that they think explains why humans behave the way they do, or why a person does what they're currently doing. It is not conjecture. It has to have empirically researched and tested data behind it. And then that data had to have been statistically analyzed correctly, and of course interpreted correctly, reviewed by other people in the scientific community as sound, and then published. Okay, so being a set of propositions is not the main point of what a theory is. It's all of the work that goes behind a theory becoming called a theory in psychological science. Now, they are the most useful tools to develop the specific research hypothesis because it provides that structure. It is a framework that you can work within. Okay? You also, in doing this very lengthy and time-consuming and labor-intensive step in the research process, by looking at that sense of your return on your investment, you put all this time, you put all this effort in finding and reading about and et cetera, to decide how you should conduct your study. Okay? If the idea has been researched a lot, then you ask yourself, how can I add? How can I improve this? If it hasn't been researched a lot, what's the best way in which I could contribute to this research, to this literature, to this theory, et cetera, et cetera. This process gives you that sense of what you should be doing. And then from there, organically, it kind of unfolds in what your hypothesis should be. And then, of course, the design of your study and collecting that data and so on and so forth. So once you've done, like I said, what majority of the research process takes in terms of time, that reviewing and reading and researching, etc., you now have come to a point where you could probably complete the third task of stage 1. Okay, that's actually developing and stating the research hypothesis itself. So theories guide hypotheses. Once you've decided on a theory that is relevant enough and is where you feel most capable working under in terms of a guide, those hypotheses will align with that theory. It will align with what other people have done under that theory. So this is the point where you make that specific assumption or prediction about variables. Okay. The key to this definition of a hypothesis is that it can be tested. So 3 main things about a research hypothesis. 1, it is developed from theory. 2, it is a statement. So it is not a question. It is written as a statement. And that statement does number 3. It predicts some kind of relationship between variables that can be tested. So I like to include this slide here because most of you should be familiar with these very, very well-known psychological theories. One is Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization, theory of self-actualization, and then classical and operant conditioning in behaviorism. Of course, Pavlov, classical conditioning, Skinner, operant conditioning. You don't need to know these for this class, but you should be familiar with them at this point in your academic career in psychology. So I refer to them to give you an idea of how many options you have for your hypotheses from a theory, right? That theory being just an interrelated, coherent set of ideas to help explain and make predictions about what people would do in a certain situation or circumstance, why people do what they do. And going from that to a specific statement predicting a relationship between variables, you can start to see almost the infinite possibilities of generating a hypothesis that can occur. Okay, so let's give the example of Maslow's theory of self-actualization. Maslow says, of course, that people cannot psychologically develop unless each of the tiers of his hierarchy are met, right? So basically, a hypothesis could be people cannot invest psychological energy into health or employment if their basic physiological needs are not met. Okay? That is a statement that specifies a relationship between variables and can be tested, right? I can test. Can people dedicate psychological energy to their health and their employment if their physiological needs are met? Okay, so that's an example of a very specific hypothesis coming from a much larger theory in psychology. However, a key component of that definition of a hypothesis is the variables part, right? Now, you should be familiar with what a variable is at this point. However, students tend to overestimate their ability to identify what's a variable and what's just a aspect of a human characteristic or of a person. For instance, green eyes. A person has green eyes. Having green eyes is not a variable, right? It's not something that varies in some way. The variable would be eye color, because a variable has to be able to vary in some way. It's a property or characteristic of an object, event, or person that can take on different values. So having green eyes or green eyes is not a variable. Eye color is a variable. Different people have different eye colors, so it varies. That's a variable. Okay. Now, what does this mean for your hypothesis? Your hypothesis has to state what the variable is. A person should be able to read it and say, okay, that right there, that variable can take on these different values, can take on these different labels and variations, etc. Okay, now this third point here, variables must be operationalized later during the research process. We will get to that in stage 2, but keep in mind that, in the research process, you would be aware of this while you're choosing how you're going to state your research hypothesis and finish up stage 1. Okay. So now that you know what a variable is, the components of stating the hypothesis is made up of course, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the nature of the relationship. Now, this could include the direction of the relationship, but it doesn't always. So, quickly, because you should be familiar with independent and dependent variables, the independent variable is the one that is manipulated. It is the one that is under the control of the researcher. Okay, I often like to put in the word chosen because they often choose how that variable will be designated in its variations. Okay, they decide how it varies and how it's going to be measured in terms of that variability. Okay, you might have noticed I am saying the word variability a lot. That is because it is the foundation for statistical analyses. All right, so as I'm using the word varying, variable, variation, become familiar with what I mean. I mean that people can take on different levels of it, different labels of it, that people are different from one another. And statistics tries to get at why we're different from each other and how we are different from each other. Okay, so just a little heads up for why this word occurs so often. So the independent variable is the one that the variations of are under the control of the researcher. That's a good way to think about it in terms of this course and trying to figure out which one's the independent, which one's the dependent. Sometimes it's also referred to as the predictor, the cause, or the treatment. The dependent variable, the researcher has no control over how it's going to vary, okay? It's measured by the researcher. They're going to try to figure out how it varies, but it can't be measured until after you're collecting the data, where the independent variable is usually decided upon how it's going to vary before you start. Okay, so measured by the researcher after is the dependent. It's expected to change or vary in response to that independent variable. So let's break down this for each of our examples here. In terms of our independent and dependent variables, for is college students' performance on tests more influenced by their motivation or their learning strategies? So back to this one. The independent variable, okay, which one, or how can I say what the researcher decided on in terms of the cause, in terms of what they're going to control in terms of variation? Well, college students' performance on tests more influenced by something or not? Well, the student's performance in this case sounds like the dependent variable to me. Okay, so I'm walking you through the process of how I would figure this out. The student performance, that's the dependent variable. That's the thing they're going to measure, okay? But in response to what? In response to two different types of ways of learning, okay? One being more motivation-based and one being more strategy-based. Okay, what could we call this? Maybe we call this instructional method. Okay. So the instructional method is not stated in the actual research question. That's okay, because it's implied. It has two different forms. It varies in two different ways. Okay? And that variation is the interest of the researcher in terms of its effect or how it is related to changes, variations, in the student's performance on test. So test performance becomes our dependent variable. So for the second one, how do parents' feeding practices affect whether their children will eat new foods? Okay, well, the independent variable is the one that causes the change in something else, or comes first, the one that the researchers are going to control, that they can control. They can say how it varies. That's feeding practices. Okay, and what do they expect to change? What do they expect will change in response to the variation of the feeding practices is, of course, the child's response. To new foods. Okay, for number 3, does coercive interrogation of eyewitnesses affect their accusations of crime suspects? Okay, well, right now, coercive interrogation of eyewitnesses, that seems like the independent variable, because we're expecting it to produce a change in those accusations. So, accusations is my dependent variable. I don't see a problem with figuring that out, but coercive interrogation, does that vary enough? Are the researchers going to only look at coercive, or are they going to look at just interrogation in general? At this point of the research process, you don't know just yet. I would just call this interrogation. Interrogation type. Okay, so now we have independent, dependent there, and then for the fourth one, gender differences in terms of who contributes to Wikipedia. Okay. What is varying under the researcher's control, right? What are they picking? What are they choosing? They're looking at gender. They decide, okay, I'm going to measure gender as maybe biological sex, maybe it's a gender identification. Maybe they're going to pick just male and female. Maybe they're going to pick male, female. I prefer not to say gender nonconforming, etc., etc. They get to pick that, right? That's another indication. Oh, that's the independent variable. Okay. So I would go and write gender there. Now for the dependent variable, it's contribution to Wikipedia. So I would write contribution to Wikipedia. Okay. So the actual researchers, this is what they chose for their independent and dependent variables. Now, the only one that's a little bit different from our, brainstorming on independent and dependent variables is the level of confidence here versus the contribution to Wikipedia here. I do this on purpose because at this stage in the research process, if we were pretending that we were just starting from that research question, we would have a less sure interpretation of what exactly the variable is going to be and how it's going to be measured just yet. Okay, that comes later. This is how the researchers labeled their variables, and this is what we'll be working with. Okay. So now that you have your variables understood and labeled correctly, and you have a comfort with them, the last part of deciding how to state the research hypothesis is to ask, what is the nature of this relationship? Unless the topic and the specific variables have been under-researched, then previous research should indicate what the nature of that relationship should be. Okay? The process of going through all of that review and finding the previous research and theories, etc., informs this very last piece of stating your research hypothesis. Okay? If you can't be specific in the direction of the nature of the relationship, then you hypothesize some kind of relationship or difference, okay? And you would know in the research process which is appropriate or not. Okay. So, obviously these researchers did their due diligence. And they were able to go in and see what other people have seen and done and found after the whole process. They were able to hypothesize these specific statements, the specific relationships between their independent variables and dependent variables. They hypothesized in number 1, that students who are taught effective learning skills will perform better on tests than students offered incentives to do well. For number 2, they hypothesize, so this is a statement about variables that can be tested. Greater use of forceful feeding practices leads to greater food refusals. The third one, they were, after doing all of their research, they hypothesized that coercive interrogation increases eyewitnesses' false accusations. And then for the 4th research study, their hypothesis was that women are less confident in contributing to Wikipedia than men. Okay? So, those are statements. They were all developed through previous research. They indicate the variables and they indicate the nature expected to be seen regarding the relationship between those variables.